Greetings, everyone. Jai Janendra, everyone. Those who don't know me, my name is Kamlesh Mehta, and I'm a CMO at Arihanta Institute. I live in California, and I belong to local Jain Center, which is Northern California. Um, it's in Milpitas, if people are joining from Chicago. I welcome you all to the second webinar series. The second webinar of the series for Pathshala students. And thank you so much for the feedback, which several people have provided for the first webinar. So that was great. Appreciate it very much. And before I begin, I do want to say thank you to our president of Local Jain Center, Devin Shah, our VP of Education for the committee, Jai Shriji, Suketu Bhai, and the entire education committee at Jain Center, and of course, all our volunteers at Arihanta Institute, who actually worked pretty hard to make this webinar possible. We also have, in a listening mode, we have Dr. Praveen Jain, who is our founder and CEO of Arihanta Institute. And so we're very delighted to have Sunilji and Umeshji as part of the webinar series today. All right, so let's kick off with our guest speaker. He's an exceptional in its work, what he has done. He is a specialist in pre-modern religious traditions of South Asia. And his key research areas are anywhere from yoga studies to religious studies, critical animal studies, environmental studies, and comparative ethics. Currently, he's very focused on the animal studies. His doctoral work actually examines animal taxonomies and their relationships to regulations on ritual sacrifice and dietary practices. In particular, he has done a lot of work and studied in depth the relationship between the Jain philosophy, Jain values, and Jain practices to animals and environment. So we're very delighted as part of the Arihanta Institute. He's a professor at Arihanta Institute. He has done several publications on veganism, animal abuse, ahimsa, and Jain yoga. So he has received his doctoral degree in religious studies from University of California in Santa Barbara, where he wrote his dissertation specifically on ancient Indian taxonomies for animals and their relevance for the religious, rituals, and dietary practices. So without further ado, I'm honored and I'm privileged to actually invite and welcome Professor Jonathan Dickstein, who will talk today about compassion to animals. So Professor Jonathan, please take from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kamlesh, and Jai Janendra, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here and an honor, especially to speak about a topic that is very dear to my heart. Speaking about compassion towards animals, nonviolence towards animals. This will be the heart of what I speak about this evening. It's also what brought me really to the Jain tradition when I started to get exposed to Indian religions, Indian philosophy, Indian ethics, practices. It took me some time, but I really started to see how Jain history had a very unique kind of disposition and way of looking out at the world towards biological life, towards animal life, and also towards our relationships with others. I have found it pretty profound at the outset, and over the years continue to find it profound, and it's really inspiring to me. So to share some of this material is exciting, and I'm really happy to do that with you this evening. So I'm going to share my screen. We will get started. What I think is really interesting as this gets set up is that sometimes nonviolence and ahimsa, nonviolence and compassion are viewed as kind of separate entities in a certain way, or separate ethics, but I kind of view them as inseparable. And so hopefully in a moment this will queue up. There we are. So I am an assistant professor at Arihanta Institute. I do work in Jain studies, animal studies, food studies, and environmental studies as well. Tonight we'll be speaking about compassion to animals. And as you probably know, the Jain tradition has this broad view about animals that I have not yet found in any other, at least major religious tradition, and certainly not one in ancient India, which is that the extension of what we might call animal life or sentient life or conscious life really goes down to the microscopic level. So just to give some terms to start, because I find them particular to the tradition and really interesting to fully capture how Jainism looks out at the world. And so it's said that when beings come into the world, they can come through one of four gatis or passages, a kind of destiny, maybe is another translation. And this means that a jiva, a soul, can come into the world either as a human, a kind of deity, kind of a hell being, or a plant, an animal. And this fourth gati includes both plants and animals. And this is referred to as tiryanch, or literally something like moving horizontally, which can refer to the motility, the ability to move of these entities, even though with plants, it's kind of not as clear, and it really depends on the plants in question, at least under, say, contemporary scientific scrutiny. But it's not really a kind of literal translation for this kind of horizontal movement for tiryanch, because there is a subsequent category of these beings as the motile, those that can move, and the immotile, those that cannot move, and mean that kind of propel on their own. And these terms, trasa and stavra, really are just kind of a thin code for plants and animals. The trasa are those that can move, and stavra, those that cannot move. And then they're even kind of quote unquote below the level of plants, you have these microscopic organisms or nigodas. And these are the most basic one-sensed organisms, the most basic organism that a jiva can come into the world and have, as you could say, a kind of body or a casing. And then you also have kind of in this area between these microbes and plants, or alongside them, you have what I refer to as elemental organisms. And these are those jivas that are encased in the elements themselves. So those that are encased in kind of earth bodies are referred to as prithvikaikas, right? Prithvi, the earth. The water-bodied entities are the apokaikas. Fire-bodied are tejokaika. Air-bodied vayokaika. And then also the technical term for plants, vanaspatikaika, plant-bodied. And then within them, you have the pratyeka sharira and the sadharana sharira. A pratyeka sharira as a plant means that the one plant has one soul, or it can have many souls. The sadharana sharira, a plant that actually has many souls associated with it instead of just one. And in many ways, this is what governs some of the dietary restrictions about plants, has to do with their kind of association with jivas. And I'll talk a little bit more about how ahimsa refers to the types of beings, the kind of categories they're in, and their sense faculties. So this is a complicated kind of chart, but it's very illustrative here, and we can sit on it for a moment. In that, what you see in most traditional Jain taxonomies, or a lot of Jain taxonomies, and this is coming from our Tadvarta Sutra, but can be found in other texts, is this taxonomy of beings that goes according to indriyas or senses: one sensed, two sensed, three sensed, four sensed, five sensed, And then there are five sensed beings. These are animals, some that are said to have a certain kind of mind and some that are not. And the idea is that these one-sensed organisms here on the left refer to plants, but also refer to those elemental organisms, such as those water body beings, and also these Nigoda or microscopic entities. And strictly speaking, with respect to senses, they have one sense, the sense of touch. And they are conscious, like in the sense that they are sentient organisms. They can feel touch and can feel what we might say pleasure or pain with respect to that kind of touch. There are other aspects of these organisms. The vitalities here, that's being translated as the pranas, it's kind of vitalities of organisms that are also relevant. But for the moment, we can really talk about how beings in the Jain taxonomical structure progress from one sense to five senses. And this is very interesting and very different from what we might see elsewhere, which thinks to group animals or even organisms based on their species, dog, cat, elephant, or because a being is of a certain species, they matter more, we should treat them a certain way, as opposed to another species. What I find fascinating about early Jainism is its focus on senses, basically saying, if you have the ability to experience the world in certain ways, that means you can kind of experience pain and pleasure and other experiences in ways different than others. And we have to kind of take that into consideration. And this is a major reason why it's said that those animals, those from 2 cents and above, here you see worms and some kind of bivalves or mollusks and so on, all the way up to say human beings and elephants, have more sense faculties than plants, and hence it's worse to harm them than it is other beings. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't have some type of regard or compassion for plants, elemental organisms, and microbes, but that our compassion, especially as we navigate our day-to-day lives, should really focus on these kind of animals, the 2 cents, 3 cents, 4 cents, and 5 cents beings. So when we read from early Jain texts, such as the Acharanga Sutra, about Lord Mahavira's kind of realization, we see this recognition from the very beginning. And this is, one of our earliest Jain texts. And to see this kind of part recognition and part feeling at the same time is remarkable. And the text reads, I say thus, all beings, those with 2, 3, 4 senses, plants, those with 5 senses, and the rest of creation, experience individually pleasure or displeasure, pain, great terror, and unhappiness. Beings are filled with alarm from all directions and in all directions. This is the saying that all of these individuals experience pleasure and displeasure, pain and terror. There is alarm from all directions. Also, it is said, for there is nothing inaccessible for death. All beings are fond of life, like pleasure, hate pain, shun destruction. Like life, long to live. To all, life is dear. So there is this recognition that all beings can experience the highest highs, the lowest lows, and these feelings in between, and we have to take that into account. So there's this recognition of what we might say the sentience of these beings, their ability to experience, while at the same time a feeling. And that's really where the compassion comes in, the kind of feeling aspect, that we can have this kind of sympathy towards those beings, because we too know what it's like to experience pain, experience pleasure, fear death, long for life, and so on. So ahimsa, right, is literally a negation of himsa, being violence or harming, and ahimsa, violence. And this is our kind of main vow in Jainism. And what I mean by the main vow is that the other vows, the Mahavratas, the Anuvratas, can kind of said to issue from this main vow of nonviolence, as others is just kind of assisting forms of nonviolence, or when they are not practiced forms of violence. But sometimes it's hard to pinpoint what exactly violence is. Like, what exactly makes something harming, or what is harmful? And while it is really complicated, I typically think of it as the infliction of dukkha by means of acts of body, speech, or mind. Now, sometimes this Sanskrit word dukkha is translated as pain. But I think with pain, we tend to think of just like physical pain, getting a burn or a cut, or some other even kind of mental pain. But dukkha across Indian traditions includes things beyond just physical pain. So I translate it as unpleasantness because it includes emotional and psychological distresses such as fear, pain, anxiety, and loneliness. And this is going to be crucial as I talk further, because when we think about non-harming and compassion, is it just compassion in the sense, or non-violence in the sense of not harming? Or do we actually have to take the other forms of unpleasantness that beings experience, such as, say, something like loneliness, which we may not think of actually occurs in non-human animals. But if you've spent time with your dog, your cat, you've spent time away from them, and you come home, you can certainly tell that they've had certain experiences while you've been gone. They might be excited to see you, but that's indicative of a way they were feeling beforehand.
Jonathan, I'll just let people know. If you have any questions, you can type in the Q&A section, and towards the end, we will take all the questions and respond to it. So you can type in the Q&A if you have questions, and we encourage all of you to do. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
That's great. And the questions can come at the end. I'm not opposed to them coming kind of in between. I'm kind of open to that, but at the end is absolutely fine. Sure. So there are many words that are used for this idea we translate it as compassion. In English, it's actually very hard to translate a lot of these various terms, such as karuna, karunya, anukampa, daya, are oftentimes used as compassion. And while it's not a vow per se in Jainism, it's more so a contemplation, a bhavana, similar to the 4 Brahma Viharas in Buddhism, and also in Patanjali's classical Yoga Shastra. Also, you have these contemplations, or what we might say attitudes, listed. And in the Jain tradition, compassion is said to strengthen the vows, and especially strengthen this orientation towards nonviolence. And I think that's extremely important to keep in mind. And I will kind of repeat this a number of times, in that there's a difference between a kind of intellectual recognition of something and an accompanying feeling. And while we can kind of talk about them interchangeably, I do really think that even the English translation's compassion really translates to this kind of feeling. So I say here that compassion is a feeling of concern for the welfare of others, especially for their experiences of unpleasantness, which means that you see another being suffering, right? You see, maybe an animal on the side of the road. Maybe it's a kind of a dog nursing a sore limb, and you have a feeling. This can occur with humans as well. And you actually have this feeling of sympathy, that their suffering matters, not because you're suffering, or not because they kind of affect your life in a certain way, but for some reason you want to relieve that. And this is kind of a natural feeling, I think, that we universally experience. So as for this idea of compassion in Jain texts, in the Tattvartha Sutras itself, you have a kind of a textual evidence for it quite early on, where the text says that the observer of the vow should cultivate friendliness, maitri, towards all living beings, delight, pramoda, in the distinction of honor of others, compassion, karunya, for the miserable, lowly creatures. I mean, this is the given translation. I don't know how much we should use miserable, lowly creatures, but referring to animals. And equanimity, madhya, towards the vainglorious. So these four things, maitri, karuna, maitri, pramoda, karunya, madhya, and it's translated differently or given different Sanskrit in other texts, are these kinds of attitudes that have been encouraged across ancient Indian traditions, and especially in the Jain tradition, for millennia to strengthen the vows. And while we are focusing here today on compassion, we could also focus on maitri, right? Friendliness towards all living beings. What might friendliness mean towards other living beings? Another example, just quickly, comes from Hemachandra's 12th century Yoga Shastra, which says that a mental action, which is performed with friendship, etc. And the etc. here, it says like maitri adi in the text, means that these other three components, they've become so standardized by this time that you don't even have to list them. You just say friendship, etc. So when you perform a mental action with these attitudes in mind, including compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, this causes wholesome karma. But when you have a mental action, or you think in a way that is overcome by passions and sense objects, that results in unwholesome karma, which will ultimately not be good for you or really kind of anyone in your vicinity. So I'm going to give an example really quickly from someone speaking outside of the Jain tradition, because I think the way that a philosopher by the name of Gary Steiner, who works on animals, talks about compassion and nonviolence, or kind of feeling and action, really captures, when I read Lord Mahavir's first insight, first experience, I feel like we have this kind of mutual occurrence of a recognition of the ethic of nonviolence with the feeling of compassion. And Steiner here says, a sense of felt kinship meaning likeness, we are like them, a sense felt kinship with animals first gives rise to a sense of compassion toward them. The intercession of reflection, so this means you first have this feeling of kinship, of likeness, and a feeling of compassion, of sympathy for their well-being. Then reflection should then lead us to the insight that animals not only merit our compassion, but also have a right not to be caused the kind of suffering that we needlessly inflict on them every day. So our experience tells us that dukkha, unpleasantness, is to be avoided. So, pain is bad no matter who experiences that pain. So when we see others' unpleasantness, we feel kinship with and compassion for them, thereby revealing the ethic of ahimsa. So I tend to view here this kind of, it is possible to interpret compassion and nonviolence as inseparable. One way to think about it, among others, is that compassion in action is nonviolence, and nonviolence in feeling is compassion. And there's a way that these are consistently reinforcing one another, in which we practice nonviolence, and that contributes to our feeling of compassion, and our feeling of compassion engenders further adherence to the vow of nonviolence. So I kind of don't really view them as separate entities at all. And sometimes you even see the terms used synonymously, as the almost meaning the same thing, I think, because of this very intrinsic natural connection between the two. So how do you perform this in action? How do we have compassion towards animals in action? So karuna and ahimsa in action. Ahimsa, nonviolence, is often said to have to follow a kind of threefold standard. And this means that when you practice nonviolence, you one, refrain from performing acts of harm oneself, krita, like I don't myself with my own hand or words or mind inflict unpleasantness on animals. Second, there's no hiring or otherwise causing others to perform acts of harm on one's behalf, karita. So maybe I say, you know what, I'm not harming an animal, but I'm gonna pay someone some money to do it for me, or I'm gonna pay to buy animal products, but I'm not gonna cause harm to the animals myself. I'm just gonna pay somebody else to do it. But this is causing harm. This is also under this threefold standard. And last, which is really interesting and maybe the most relevant for us today, is consenting to acts of harm being performed in one's presence or vicinity, anumata, right? The idea that it's not enough to restrain yourself from harm, but if you allow it to happen around you and you don't do anything about it, you also, in a way, are guilty of himsa, of violence. So as I say here, the first two aspects explicitly indicate restraints, things you shouldn't do, such as not harming animals oneself or paying others to do it. And these are direct motivations for something like vegetarianism and veganism, right? You're kind of restraining yourself from engaging in actions and processes that harm animals. But the third aspect, anumata, points to an active ahimsa. Now, I think I'm not going to call it necessarily active and others non-active, but what I mean by active is it's not necessarily something you don't do, but something you do. It's proactive. Maybe that's a kind of a better way to understand that it's a kind of moving out into the world. And so it's about what you can do to help animals by preventing harm, neglect, and killing done to them by others. One way, and it's a way that I'm going to focus on this evening, is that rescuing and caring for animals is a direct way to actualize this aspect of ahimsa.
In case you want to take questions, Jonathan, there are two questions on the.
Oh, sure. We can take a question.
So I'll just read out the question. How is compassion to all beings different from being non-violent as rule of not harming?
Okay, and I see there's another one. It's related. What happens if we feel compassion for others but are unable to act on a situation for which we feel compassion? Well, these are challenging questions. So how is compassion to all beings different from being non-violent as a rule of non-harming? Is that, for example, we could be non-violent, say not act in certain ways, but maybe just do it because we're told to do so. We don't really have a feeling compassion per se, but we're kind of acting in ways that seem to be non-violent. But this is not really sustainable, and it really doesn't engender that kind of mental ahimsa that seems to rely on compassion. And so I think there's a difference then between just not being nonviolent, but then also understanding the motivation behind nonviolence, which is that other beings can suffer, and we feel a certain way about that because we know their suffering matters. And I think the second question is interesting too. What happens when we can't act on a situation? Well, I think the feeling of compassion and the impetus is the first step. And then how can we maybe slowly start to begin to act? How can we slowly start to say, intervene in our life? Maybe someone's talking a certain way about animals that promotes violence towards them or a lack of compassion, and we speak up. Maybe that's the first thing we do. So I give here as an example, the animal sanctuary, the Pandrapol is a great example of active ahimsa. There's this great book that was written, decades ago by Derek Lodrick about animal sanctuaries in India, and noted that inscribed in some prominent position over a door or gateway in all Pindra poles can be found the words Ahimso Paramo Dharma, right? Ahimsa is the greatest of religions or duties. So this idea that animal rescue and the animal sanctuary is directly kind of a manifestation, an actualization of Ahimsa because of the compassion we feel towards animals and the need to take care of them. So here's an image. A great example is Love and Arms Animal Sanctuary in Erie, Colorado, founded by two Jains, Charlene and Shilpi Shah, who I consider dear friends of mine. And this is me maybe a little under 10 years ago at the old location of Love and Arms in Lafayette, Colorado. And when you go to a place such as this, you come into contact with individual animals. And if I can impress maybe one thing this evening is that what is so important in compassion towards animals is that we don't view them as kind of animals, this just kind of faceless mass, like pigs, cows, goats. But like each of them are individuals. This is Alfie the goat on with me in the photograph. I've known Alfie for 8 years. All the way on the right is Felix, a pig I've also known for 8 years. And while it might seem strange for us to kind of talk about animals in this way, it's because we've almost been trained not to have compassion to them as individuals. So I really think kind of understanding that while we talk about animals in general, each of them have their own personality, their own likes, their own dislikes, ways they like to be interacted with. They have friends, they have animals they don't like very much. And I think this, if you can ever interact with animals beyond just say dogs, cats, and our typical kind of companion animals, you really start to feel this kind of compassion for all beings that, the Jain tradition, at least in my reading, is very much founded upon. So animal sanctuaries such as Love and Arms do not only show compassion towards animals by rescuing them from himsa, violence, and dukkha, pain, but they also promote their well-being. They want their animals to thrive. And this is also something that is important, is that we can exercise compassion towards animals by not harming them. But what about actually giving them enjoyment? Dogs and cats are constantly given toys and walks and played with. We understand that their well-being, their positive experiences are so important to them. Why not these other animals? So on animal sanctuaries, this can be done through consistent positive human-animal interactions, personalized diets. What do they like to eat? What do they not like to eat? Each of them. Blending flocks. What does this mean? It means that goats and chickens can get along together. Cows and pigs might get along together. The idea that we have to separate animals based on species is kind of this old thinking about animals when they're on farms, kind of not being treated as individuals with personalities. So a lot of these places like to blend flocks, meaning bringing different kinds of animals together. Animal-centered design for their surroundings, meaning how do we make their surroundings consistent with their personalities? And what do goats like to do? What do chickens like to do? What do cows like to do? The inclusion of toys and other sources of stimulation and increased communication through methods such as clicker play. So at Arihanta Institute, we even have a course that people can take that's called Animal-Centered Design. And these are people at a animal rescue, Piedmont Farm Animal Rescue. And they say that through animal-centered design, this means like organizing the environment with the animal's desires in mind. We can move away from traditional farm structures and landscapes and towards spaces that put the needs and wants of the animals in the forefront. Animal-centered design does not have one particular aesthetic or value or style, but is instead based on a set of ideas, values, and priorities. What does this mean? It means that animal-centered design means human beings finally kind of perceiving and listening to animals and their needs and desires, and doing our best to organize the space around them in the way they would like it. Maybe just like your room at home, maybe the way you like to set up your desk. It's a very similar situation. Oops. Yeah. Okay. So, thought maybe we could pause here and I'll show an example. What I'm calling a clicker play at Love and Arms. It's kind of a very short video. I think we have time to show it. So I'm going to drop out of this share screen and share a different one. So here's a very short example of what Love and Arms refers to as clicker play. And this is very short of the chicken, but it's a way to engage forms of communication with animals, not only for their stimulation, but so they can communicate their needs.
Get it. Way to go. Good job. And that's a hard behavior because it's hard to teach animals to move away from you when they know you have treats. Get it. So that's the behavior she's been working on to be able to. We've been taking it all over the place.
So
Get it.
but here, what she said was that you hear the click in the background as kind of positive reinforcement and teaching this chicken to actually move away from her when she knows she has treats. So this is a way of developing a language between the two. And here's just an example, a description of what they do overall in this program at Love and Arms.
Cheryl and Shartrina, we just saw some incredible footage of the chicken playing.
Yeah. Gracie
playing with clicker play. And we were talking about how it's a way for animals, especially others like the donkeys, to have built trust. Mm-hmm. So how would you explain this process of building trust and the clicker play helping for animals to begin to trust the humans that are now trying to care for them after they've been abused in the past?
Right. I think what clicker play does is it gives a shared language, a shared communication that they can then express what they need, and we can ask them for things we need from them, whether that's walking on a halter or going, voluntarily opting in for care. And it gives them a mechanism by which they can express themselves without fear of punishment and with actually good outcomes at the end, right? So it gives them those positive relationships with people where they can communicate in a clear way. They can get the outcomes that they're looking for. All that animals are doing with behavior is they're just trying to get to an outcome that feels good for them, whether that's getting away from something, getting treats, any number of things, right? So we can help them express that behavior in a positive way so that they can get what they need from us. And that's building that confidence and that trust between people, that they know that they can trust us, that if they do the thing we need from them, they will get what they want out of it as well.
Interspecies communication.
Yeah.
So there's this discussion of interspecies communication and animals being able to communicate what they need. And it's maybe no different than if we're human beings speaking different languages. What do we do? What do we do if we can't immediately communicate our needs to someone else in our own language? We need another language. And so that someone else can care for us. And so there are numerous designs. There's clicker play, there is animal-centered design, and so on. Oh, they kicked me back to the beginning. Let's just go ahead. And so lastly, I'd like to talk about another way, and this is related to the question that I mentioned earlier that asked, what happens if we feel compassion but are unable to act in that situation? Is that there are many ways in which in our minds we can be compassionate and in many ways, how we speak, be compassionate. And so I ask you to consider how intellectual and linguistic, what I'll call violence in a way, encourages physical violence towards animals, and how compassion and nonviolence in thought and words encourages the opposite. So I'll give an example here. Consider how often, or consider how humans often refer to animals as its, right? And so here's a couple examples. Look at the bird. It is going into the tree trunk. Or, I got a new dog. It is 6 months old, right? This seems to be something very minor, right? We do it all the time. And if you actually start to listen for it, and I think this is a way to practice compassion in a very basic way, you'll hear it being used all the time. But this kind of language treats animals like objects, as if they lack consciousness and individuality, which Jainism says is precisely untrue, is entirely untrue. Especially these five-sensed organisms, which are mammals, birds, fishes, they all are said to possess some form of mind and have a very sophisticated kind of sense apparatus, or ability to feel. So what I think is a compassionate and nonviolent approach to speaking about animals is using the proper pronouns, such as he, she, or they. That's not too far-fetched, because I think when we speak about the dogs and cats we keep at home, we often do use these kind of pronouns. Oh, that's your dog. Oh, that's he, that's Leo. Or that's his toy. That's her ball. That's their whatever. There's ways in which we treat pets as individuals. And if people refer to our pets as its, as objects, we might even get offended. So I think one way to exercise compassion and kind of encourage nonviolence, because the more we treat animals like individuals and not like objects, the more people are less likely to treat them like objects, like rocks, like balls, like whatever else, but like individuals that deserve compassion. Here's a couple other examples. These are other terms that depersonalize animals. What I mean by that is they make them not seem like individuals with personalities. And we see this all the time, especially in food products: chicken, fish, cattle, livestock, veal or beef, pork, bacon, seafood. Even a term like chicken kind of makes chicken seem like a mass of chicken, when in fact there are chickens, like Gracie, the one that was doing the clicker play. Or fish are just seem to be kind of a general mass of fish, not fishes. And then think about how terms like veal or beef are actually talking about the physical bodies of animals, but we have these euphemisms, these terms that make us think that we're not talking about animals anymore. Or pork, right? The kind of meat that comes from pigs, but these are pigs who are killed. So we have to understand that when you hear these terms, these are ways in which animals are being treated like objects. And I really think that by being sensitive to them in our minds and changing the way we speak about food, the way we speak about animals, really contributes to a form of ahimsa in speech and in mind. And it comes from this place of compassion, because the more that we obscure it, the more that we treat animals like objects, and the more that we kind of allow violence to be perpetrated around us, we don't seem to be acting compassionately. So kind of, I'll just say a few more things. And, you know, maybe in the Q&A, or maybe I can pause for a moment and look at the Q&A. I see that there's another question: what are places where one can go to help animals in California? I could certainly respond later with a greater list. What first comes to mind is the Gentle Barn in Southern California, outside of Los Angeles. That's an easy search, called the Gentle Barn. And there's also Happy Hen Animal Sanctuary that is in San Luis Obispo. There are more up north. I'm sure you're talking about Northern California. But I spent my doctoral work and most of my time in California, in Southern California. So it would just take me a little bit more, easy searching, but I'm sure you can travel not far at all from the Jain Center to these locations. And I highly encourage it. I know I've said it before, but if you talk to Shailene Shah at Love and Arms in Colorado, where I've spent a lot of time, people talk always about it's the interaction that does it. We can think about these things kind of in the clouds in our heads, but go to these places, lock eyes with these individuals, pay attention to them, and that will communicate, in my opinion, the feeling of compassion more so than even me talking about it. So ways to be compassionate and nonviolent towards animals. And what I want to say is these are just a few examples. And I think I'd really like to ask you, what are some other ways, or maybe you can ask some questions for us to conjure some other ways. But these are just ways that I've thought about. Now, there's the immediate one, to practice vegetarianism or veganism. Right, this is, what attracted me to Jainism from the start, and what I try to communicate with a lot of people in, say, kind of doing animal advocacy, doing work for animals, or trying to do work about vegetarianism or veganism, is I like to say, you have to go see what the Jains have been doing for millennia, not just the practice of vegetarianism, or not just the practice, not eating meat, but specifically because of concern for the animals, out of compassion. Right, nowadays, there are all other ways that people maybe are vegetarian or vegan, right? They're concerned about the environment or concerned about their health. And these are completely valid, but Jainism for millennia has been talking about these animals themselves. Second, speak up and teach others about what you're doing, your vegetarianism or veganism, maybe around your kind of Jain community. That's obvious. But what about those outside of the community that you interact with? I think some people think that vegetarianism or in veganism in Jainism is just kind of something that Jains do, and it's not for anybody else. But when you talk about compassion and nonviolence, you're speaking in a language that everybody can understand. It kind of really makes it clear what this guiding force is about. Third, speak up about any violence towards animals. So like I said, you're in a conversation, people are laughing about violence towards animals, or kind of laughing in some way about someone eating meat or non-eating meat. Speak up, say, these are animals we're talking about here. These are animals that actually can feel things, like your dog, like your cat. And there's a kind of violence in speech we do by letting that happen. Again, modify your thinking and speech about animals. Now, outwardly, consider rescuing an animal, not only a dog or cat, but other animals such as rabbits, rodents, or chickens. That might sound a little bizarre, but this is the way in which we've been taught to think about animals. Only dogs and cats, for example, are pets. But you can rescue all kinds of animals and bring them into your home. So consider whether or not you can rescue a dog or a cat who are also in need, but consider rescuing other animals and familiarizing yourself with them to engender greater compassion. Consider volunteering at a local animal shelter or sanctuary. This can mean going in once in a while, helping out, cleaning, feeding, engaging in other ways with these animals, and learn more about the things that I'm kind of talking about generally, but learn them for yourself. And also support, however possible, local animal sanctuaries. So some people might say, hey, I can't get out to this sanctuary and do this. I don't have the time. I don't have the energy. Who knows? I don't have the means. But do you have the ability to be active on social media, In the years that come, can some of your, say, other skills, such as accounting skills or something else, be put to use? Keep in mind that for any organization, you need all kinds of individuals, and all of your skills can be used to help promoting nonviolence towards animals and compassion towards them as well. So I asked you in closing, what other ways do you think would help animals that would be in line with these ideas of nonviolence and compassion? Thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking on this topic.
I think wonderful content, Professor Jonathan. Really appreciate it. There's one question that has come. Can you give us an example of wholesome karma and unwholesome karma? Can you take that question?
Right, so we have kind of these harming karmas and for non-harming karmas. And so, when we operate, say, in a view of karma in which ultimately, right, all karma is bad in a sense. We're trying to engage in a karmic process of shedding all of our karma so we can eventually be kind of liberated. So unwholesome karma can really be attracted by any form of harm that is undertaken, especially with passions like greed, delusion, and so on, or deceit. But there's also other kinds of karma, such as, say, lifespan, or kind of aspects that we have that are karma that are contributed just to operating in the world, that are non-harming karmas. There's also a way we can think about what we might say good karma, which is kind of ways in which we act under certain desires that might cause this karma, but it's for the sake of kind of avoiding more negative karmas. So it's just kind of a roundabout way to saying that, yes, ultimately they're kind of all not really desire. They're all not, we would like to shed all the karmas eventually. But there are certainly some that are worse than others.
If there are any other questions, you can post it on the Q&A, and we'll almost the time. But if there's any other question, we can.
Oh, I love questions like this. This is like, I really find them wonderful, because they're about the real world. Right, it says here, if I see a worm crossing the path, is it okay to move it to the side? Or am I causing trouble for it by putting it in the wrong direction than it wanted to go? I remember being at the Jaina convention, and someone asked me that, they had working in an animal shelter, and animals were being euthanized, which is usually, supposedly euthanasia is in the animal's best interest. And they asked me, feel conflicted. Right, I feel conflicted. In this situation, I don't think there's going to be one answer kind of all the time. But in this situation, you're trying to prevent harm, right? If there's a worm in a pathway in which you think that they are in danger from, say, cars, bikes, feet, whatever else, then the compassionate action would seem to be to relocate them to safety. Keep in mind, these paths, these roads, and so on are constructed by humans for human affairs, and they put other animals in danger. So I think this could be a wonderful way to practice this kind of prevention of harm to others. I saw another question. Kamlesh, you have your hand up as well?
No, let's take first our audience question here. Mine is, we can talk.
I can read it. How to communicate and spread ahimsa without challenging others?
Well, right, compassion guides us here as well. Right, there's a phrase we say sometimes, like, you have to meet people where they are. Right, you have to meet people where they are in their life at a certain time. And if you're trying to communicate the truth without really changing or affecting someone else, it seems more about your desire to be right than to actually communicate something to them. And so I think there are just ways, compassionate, nonviolent communication, right? It's the same way, put yourself in their shoes. Imagine why they think a certain way. And respect where they come from. I find this to be hard. Honestly, doesn't matter what age you are, to speak to someone and say, I hear you. I'm listening to your opinion. I respect it. But I also want to share a different interpretation. And then you can start talking about ahimsa and karuna. And when they feel respected and heard, you're more likely to be heard by them. It takes a lot of patience and practice, but it works.
Okay, question from Kamlesh Bhai.
Oh, it's more of an interesting, just an observation to look at it more from a different point of view. So the question or the thought process I have is specifically, I'm looking more from an academic side than anything else. Are humans more violent than animals, or vice versa? Is there any academic study being done on this segment of the conversation?
You said, are humans more violent than animals?
Yeah. Or vice versa. Are animals more violent than humans?
So we come back to the beginning of the talk where I say, when we're trying to define what violence is and the difference between violence and harm, and does it indicate a kind of intention? Does it indicate a certain kind of consciousness? Then I think we get into tricky territory. But in many ways, it seems that human beings tend to act in certain violent ways towards animals that are extremely unnecessary. And in many ways try to kind of promote a kind of superiority towards animals, because maybe we are scared, maybe we are nervous, maybe we need to feel good about ourselves in a certain way. And so we devise all these ways in which we subordinate animals, right? We say, they're just an animal. Just think about the phrase, just an animal, right? It's already a phrase of subordination and in a sense, discrimination. And in many ways, the ways animals act towards one another, obviously a lot of it is need-based, but I won't deny that there seems to be ways that animals act towards others that are also not based in, say, just eating or satisfying basic needs. And what to me that points to is that these animals themselves have a very rich life, internal mental lives, and are capable of some of the same emotions and thought processes and insecurities that human animals are. So it's not really answering your question directly. I mean, if you push me, it's hard for me not to think that humans on a mass scale are devising ways of violence towards other humans and animals that's kind of unprecedented and unparalleled. And I say this sadly. And so at the very least, our work is to.
Isn't that because that is visible to us, whereas the entire animal kingdom, we don't know, or we are still learning about them? But it's something to look at more from an academic point of view. I can have discussion with you some other time, but thank you so much.
And we also can have a great discussion lastly about whether, how do we talk about ethics for animals? This is also an academic topic. Do people say, do animals have ethics amongst themselves? Right, very complicated.
Yeah.
Can I share an experience I had in Africa? We were on a safari, and this question came up exactly. Are humans more violent than animals? At least the guide that we had there, he was of the view that humans are much more violent than animals because of the intent of causing harm. Animals, you can see that a lion, when it's fed, any animal can go around that lion, they won't touch it. And we saw that. Whereas humans, they go hunting just for the fun of it. So I don't know if it's a definitive answer or not, but at least over there, we felt humans are more violent than animals.
Now, I'm just curious about the academic study of, but thank you,
Yeah.
Praveen.
And the reason that guide gave us was because humans think they are more intelligent, so they can do whatever they want to do. Anyway, I'll stop here.
And this will be just to wrap that up. I mean, on the academic side, I think if you talk to most academics, they will say it's still the same answer. Not to give a kind of sad statistic, but I consistently think about how in the United States alone, we have, 300 chickens are killed every second. Right? This is a fact that almost our brains cannot really understand, right? And we're not, if we start talking about aquatic animals, fishes and so on, it's just in trillions, right? We're actually in some numbers that stop making any kind of sense. So it's hard for me to imagine otherwise, but I am certainly willing to engage that conversation further, Carlos. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
I think there's one more question that just came in. Let me see. Yeah, I think Suketubhai just kind of put his thoughts on the same question. Very good question. Intent, greed-based, and impact of human violence is much bigger. Very true. Yeah.
And also a way to think about it, as Parvinji brought up, was that I think there is this assumption that lions, for example, these kinds of wild animals live in a state of kind of pleasure or enjoyment, and that this kind of violence they enact is similar to the way humans act. But these kinds of big cats in the wild live in states of almost near starvation all the time. It's desperation in many ways. Animals do not eat for many days at a time, so that it's always in a state of unpleasantness, or at least almost always. And I think it's very sad to think about, but yes, there's a kind of world, a non-human world, that also has a lot of suffering in it. And there are scholars, even academics and activists, who are really interested in what's called wild animal suffering. We're always talking about farmed animals. We're always talking about, pets, but what about, even though the wild is diminishing day by day, what's going on out there, and do we have obligations? I think that is a wonderful question and a beautiful horizon for our ethics.
Just a quick thought, Jonathan, on this question about how to communicate and spread ahimsa without challenging others. When you talk about this with the, particularly in the Western world, do say anybody here who is not necessarily who is actually a non-vegetarian, let's say, their response sometimes comes out to be, "Hey, you are a vegetarian, agreed, but here also we all know plant has a life. So you are killing as well, and it's both are killing." So I know the variation by census is different, but have you had challenges from the Western world about this question, and how have you tackled it?
It's a great question, and I think it really depends, right, who we're talking to. If we're talking to a Jain audience in a Jain worldview, it's one lens. Those not from the Jain worldview, it's a different lens. And why I say that is because the dominant Western philosophical and scientific perspective would be that plants are not sentient. They don't have kind of a nervous system. They don't have any experiences whatsoever. They can't suffer. This is not the Jain perspective, I'm saying, but there are other people in West kind of non-Jain context that say otherwise, but I think the dominant perspective is that. And so I think we can first point to the fact that, based looking at the kind of biology of these organisms, most likely they are not feeling anything from a scientific perspective. But I think the most powerful argument that kind of can be spread across a Jain and non-Jain perspectives is that we kill more plants to feed the farmed animals that we eventually kill and consume than if we just consume the plants ourselves. You see what I mean? If we just fed ourselves on plants, we would kill far less plants than we would kill, that we do kill, by feeding them to these higher sensed beings and then kill those beings as well. So I tend to think that to be the kind of conversation kind of concluder, because it's a moot point. And we can talk in the clouds all day about philosophy and kind of abstract concepts, but in the real world, the answer to some of those questions won't matter, because we kill more plants when we eat animals than if we just ate the plants and didn't eat the animals. Maybe that's the best way to communicate it, in a way that doesn't force a worldview on anyone. You're just presenting kind of basic facts.
I think we're almost time, so to the closing now. So thank Jai Jinendra, everyone, and thank you all for joining. Thank you, Professor Jonathan. I think another wonderful session. I thoroughly enjoyed it, particularly about the Char Bhavna and Maitri, Karuna, Pramod, and Madhyasth Bhavna, and also being sensual about using he or she, about all the including pets, birds, everything. It's amazing way of looking at it. Thank you all for people, all the community members who have joined from JCNC, of Southern California, Chicago, Houston, and also from our JCNC Pathshala. Thank you to the JCNC coordinators, president, the vice VP of Education Committee, and Suketubai, who is our coordinator for the Shalas. Really appreciate it. We really want to continue doing these sessions, so please, it's so powerful and so meaningful for all our Jains. So please communicate to your friends and your Shala classes, so we can spread the word and have more people benefit from this wonderful. We will continue to do a few more sessions till the end of this school year. So next we'll be talking about climate change and environment, on social justice, Jain social justice, ethics. Some of those topics we'll be tackling next. So really invite everyone to, and please spread the word as well, so we can have more people benefit from this. We're really excited about this pilot program, and we look forward for more Jain community members across the globe joining this. The next session will be on April 18th, about 3 weeks from now, because of Mahavijan Klinak. There are some preparations going on, so we'll do it in 3 weeks. And we look forward for all of you to join, and we plan to bring other professors as well. And thank you for Professor Jonathan. It was really wonderful. And thank you all the community members for joining. There is one question. Okay, so Ketubai, thank you. Thank you. He's communicating. Thank you. And we really appreciate all of you.